The earth was still young when the first blood touched it. No steel had yet been forged. No cities had yet been built. Humanity's voice was still new, still trembling with the wonder of life. But somewhere, in a lonely field beneath an indifferent sky, that voice was broken, not by nature's wrath, but by human hands. The story you think you know is wrapped in the soft linen of myth. Two brothers, one offering rejected, the other consumed by envy, and a single act that changed everything. A neat parable told in temples and books, its edges worn smooth by centuries of retelling. But the truth, when you strip away the comfort of legend, is darker. This was not just a quarrel between brothers. This was the first time a human stood over another human and decided, "You will not see another sunrise." It was the first betrayal that came not from the beasts of the wild, but from the heart of kinship itself. Imagine it. The silence after the blow, the body still warm against the soil, the strange metallic scent of blood mixing with dust. There is no word yet for murder, no law to condemn it, no precedent to guide what comes next. Only shock and the terrible recognition that this thing is possible. And from that day forward, humanity would never again be innocent. The air was still clean enough to taste. Not the taste of smoke or iron or rot, but the faint sweetness of grass that had never been trampled by armies, of streams that had never run red. The sky seemed closer then, its blue unbroken by the black trails of burning cities. The wind came without warning, brushing skin like a passing thought, carrying the scents of wet earth and ripened grain. And beneath it all was the low hum of a world still learning the sound of human footsteps. The first families walked this land as though it were a borrowed thing. They remembered, dimly, painfully, a garden where hunger had no teeth, where death was only a word without meaning. That memory hung around them like the last warmth of a fire gone out, enough to comfort, enough to wound. They were not yet hardened. Their hands bore calluses now, but their eyes still carried the softness of creatures who once lived without fear. The days came simply. Morning began with the ache of bending backs, the clink of stones struck together, the slow whisper of seeds falling into tilled furrows. The air was filled with the steady rhythm of wooden tools cutting into the earth, of flocks shifting under the watchful gaze of shepherds. Speech was sparse, as though every word might deplete some unseen store. But when they spoke, it was in voices that still assumed the other would listen. There were no walls yet, no prisons, no graves. Disputes ended in silence, in turned backs, not in wounds. In the evenings, the fire's light painted their faces in gold and shadow, and the darkness beyond seemed infinite, a reminder that the world was far larger than their small gatherings. They had no need to name trust. It was as natural as breath, and just as invisible. Yet even in this unscarred place, something unseen moved at the edges. A pause in conversation too long to ignore. A glance held a fraction too long across the fire. A tightening of the jaw when one man's harvest was heavier than another's. Small things, fragile, almost nothing, but in them, a new kind of weight began to gather. It was as if the earth itself could feel it, in the rustle of grass where no wind blew, in the way the animals startled more easily, their eyes rolling white in the dark. The air seemed to hold its breath at times, as though it sensed what the people could not, that the glass world was not unbreakable. In the distance, the horizon swelled with dusk. Shadows reached longer, creeping into the spaces between them. And somewhere, though no one yet knew it, the first crack had already formed. It was too small to see, too quiet to hear, but it was there, waiting, patient, inevitable. They were born into the same dust, breathed the same wind, drank from the same stream that carved its way through the earth like a patient hand. Their names were not yet heavy with story. They were simply brothers. Cain, the elder, shoulders already bent from the stubborn weight of soil. Abel the younger, his skin warm with the scent of sheep and sun. Cain's days were slow and deliberate. The earth did not yield easily, and he met its silence with his own. His palms were thick with callus, each furrow carved in the ground like a promise made under breath. There was a quiet pride in the straightness of his rows, in the way the stalks rose obediently toward the sky. He moved with the patience of one who knew the land would remember his touch. Abel moved differently, lighter, quicker, as though the wind favored him. His flock stirred at his voice, pressing close when shadows lengthened. He knew the weight of wool, the tremor in a lamb's first steps, the strange comfort of warm breath against his hands on cold mornings. The ground did not resist him. It followed beneath his feet. They shared bread, water, laughter. When the day's work was done, Cain would watch his brother's face in the firelight, the easy way he smiled, the unthinking kindness in the tilt of his head. And Abel in turn saw the way Cain's eyes measured the world, slower, heavier, as though every grain of soil had to be accounted for. There were moments, small, almost invisible, when one would linger at the edge of the other's work. Cain pausing beside the sheepfold, watching the flock move like a single living thing. Abel passing his hand over the ripening heads of grain, eyes tracing the neat, disciplined lines. In those glances was something like admiration, but also a question neither could name. They were bound by the same blood, yet their lives grew from different seeds. Cain's hands smelled of earth even after washing. Abel's carried the tang of lanolin and grass. Theirs was not yet a rivalry, not yet a wound, only the quiet tension of two paths running side by side, close enough to touch, never crossing. When they worked, the sounds of their labors filled the air. The slow scrape of a hoe through dry soil, the hollow bleat of a restless lamb, the sigh of wind through barley stalks, the clink of water poured into a trough. It was a world built from repetition, from the quiet certainty that tomorrow would be much the same. But beneath the surface there was a fragility neither named, a bond that seemed solid only because it had never been tested. It was in the way Cain sometimes paused mid-stride when Abel's laughter carried over the hills, in the way Abel's eyes sometimes softened at the sight of his brother working alone in the fading light. Nothing yet had broken between them, no word sharp enough to cut, no act bitter enough to scar, and yet the closeness they shared was like clay left in the sun, firm to the touch, but already losing its moisture, already hardening in ways they could not feel. The days still ended with the same fire, the same bread, the same unspoken trust, but somewhere in the spaces between their footsteps, the first faint tremor had begun, so small it could pass for nothing, so quiet it could be mistaken for peace. The morning began with a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the air itself had been told to wait. Cain rose before the sun, his breath pale in the cool darkness, hands already roughened from days spent gathering the best of his harvest. Each grain, each fig, each sheaf had been chosen with care, a careful arrangement laid upon woven reeds. He touched them once more, almost tenderly, before lifting the weight into his arms. Across the clearing, Abel moved among his flock. The animals stirred at his presence, their low murmurs breaking the silence. He chose without hesitation, the firstborn, unblemished, warm with the pulse of life still strong beneath the skin. His hands knew the feel of muscle beneath wool, the subtle tension in the animal's frame. There was no trembling in him. The place of offering was bare earth, flattened and darkened by many feet. Cain arrived first, setting his baskets down with a careful symmetry. The fruits gleamed in the morning light. The grain caught the wind like small whispers. He stepped back, wiping dust from his palms, eyes fixed on the horizon. Abel came soon after, the lamb cradled in his arms. He moved as though the ground had softened beneath him, as though each step brought him closer to something certain. Cain watched without expression as Abel laid his offering down, the creature's soft bleat fading into the still air. They waited. It was a waiting that hollowed the chest, that made the heart pound too loudly against the ribs. No words passed between them. Their breathing became the only sound. The air seemed to draw tight around them, pressing in, as if the entire world leaned forward to see which way the scales would tilt. Then it came, not a sound, not a voice, but a clarity that could not be mistaken. Abel's offering was taken, lifted beyond reach, its acceptance as undeniable as sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Cain's steps remained, untouched. The moment lasted only a breath, but in that breath Cain felt the ground shift beneath him. It was as if the earth had turned its face away, as if the sky had measured him and found him wanting. Heat rose in his chest, crawling up his throat, settling behind his eyes. He kept them fixed on the ground, on the neat arrangement of fruit and grain that now seemed pitiful, small, laughably human. Abel's eyes were on him, not in mockery, not even in pity, but in something far worse, the easy stillness of a man who has nothing to prove. That look slid into Cain like a blade, and he could not decide if he wanted to flee it or shatter it. Around them, the wind carried the scent of burnt offering. Sharp and final, Cain breathed it in, and it burned. The air seemed colder now, his hands heavier, his body too large for the space he stood in. The silence between them thickened, filling with everything neither could say. In that silence, something took root in him. Not yet rage. Rage is hot, bright, loud. This was quieter, denser, like a stone dropped into deep water, disappearing from sight, but sinking further with each passing moment. When they turned to leave, Abel stepped ahead, his shadow falling long across the ground. Cain followed, eyes fixed on the curve of his brother's back, the easy swing of his arms. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the dust clung more stubbornly to his feet. Behind them, Cain's offering lay in the dust, already beginning to wither in the sun. The fruit would rot, the grain would scatter, and somewhere deep inside him, Cain knew he would not forget the weight of this moment, the way rejection had wrapped itself around his name, the way the air had closed against him, the way his brother's acceptance had felt like a theft. The days after the offering felt longer, though the sun moved the same across the sky. Cain still rose before dawn, still pushed his hands into the soil, still turned it over with the same stubborn rhythm, but something in him had shifted. The work no longer breathed life into him. It pressed against his chest like a weight that would not move. The earth he had once trusted felt indifferent. Now, the grain bending away from his hands as though it knew. He spoke less, not just to Abel, but to all of them. When his mother called, he answered only with a nod. When his father's voice carried across the field, he did not look up. Even the sound of Abel's steps, light, unburdened, made him turn his head away. At night, he lay on his mat with his eyes open, the firelight flickering across the roof, replaying the moment again and again, the untouched offering, the smell of Abel's acceptance rising like incense into the air, the look in his brother's eyes. He began to talk to Abel when no one was there, not aloud, but in the silence of his mind, questions he would never voice, accusations that tasted like ash on his tongue. Sometimes he imagined Abel answering, and in those imagined replies was always the same unbearable calm, the same soft pity that had burned him on that day. He hated it. He hated that he could not escape it, even alone. When Abel passed, Cain's eyes followed him. At first, it was habit, a brother watching a brother, but the watching grew sharper, longer. He began to measure the distance between them in paces, to notice the way Abel's back turned without fear, the curve of his neck when he bent to drink from the stream, the shape of his shadow in the dusk. He began to see these things not as they were, but as they might be when stilled, when gone. The fields seemed to shrink. The hills that had once rolled open toward the horizon now closed in, trapping him inside a narrowing circle. It was as if the world had conspired to give him only one view: Abel before him, Abel above him, Abel always just out of reach. And in that shrinking space, thought turned into something denser, heavier. There was no moment of decision, no lightning strike of choice. The thought began like a splinter, and each day pressed it deeper. It was not that Abel had to die, not at first. It was that the world would never feel level until he was gone. The balance would never tilt back until that space Abel occupied was emptied. He found himself rehearsing it in fragments, his hands tightening around a stone as he walked by the stream, his steps slowing as Abel moved ahead of him on the path, the faint shift in the air when they were alone. Each image faded quickly, leaving him breathless, but each time it returned, it stayed longer. Cain's silence became a kind of cloak. His family looked at him and saw the same man, the same bent shoulders, the same rough hands, but inside the ground was eroding. Even when he stood still, it felt as if he were leaning forward, drawn towards something inevitable. One night, lying in the dark, he felt it fully for the first time, not as a passing thought, but as a presence that had settled beside him. It whispered without words, and he knew then there was no going back. His life and Abel's had been bound together since birth, but the knot was tightening into something that could no longer hold them both. In the morning, the sun rose on the same fields, the same flocks, the same quiet routines. But in Cain's chest, the shadow had deepened, and it carried only one truth: the world would not breathe right until his brother's breath was gone. The morning was without wind. The trees stood still, their leaves hanging heavy, as though the air itself refused to move. Cain rose with a calmness that was not peace, but something colder, more deliberate. His hands worked as they always had, gathering, lifting, setting aside. Yet every movement was muffled inside him, as if his thoughts were walking several paces ahead, leading him towards something that could not be named aloud. Abel was near the fold, tending to the flock. He did not notice at first the way Cain lingered. Watching, the animals shifted restlessly, sensing what men could not. Cain called to him, his voice steady. There was no tremor, no hint of what lived beneath the skin. Abel followed. The path into the field was narrow, the grass damp from a night's unseen dew. The soil was soft underfoot, giving slightly with each step. They walked in silence, side by side, the space between them just enough to keep their arms from brushing. Abel's gaze moved across the hills, his mind somewhere on the work ahead. Cain's gaze never left his brother. There came a point where the voices of the camp no longer reached them, where only the hum of insects filled the air. Here the world was stripped to the two of them, to the ground beneath and the sky above. This was the place. Cain felt it, the way one feels the threshold of a door, a boundary you cannot cross without changing what you are. He could have stopped then. The thought came and went like a flicker of light, a final offering from a part of him that still remembered what it was to be clean. But he stepped forward instead. Abel knelt to examine the ground, brushing aside the stems with his hand. He did not see Cain's shadow draw closer. The stone in Cain's palm was not heavy, yet it seemed to pull his arm downward. His breath slowed, his grip tightened. For a heartbeat, time hesitated. Then the arm moved. The sound was not what he expected. Not loud, not sharp, a dull, wet crack, swallowed quickly by the open air. Abel's body jolted, his knees giving way, his hands reaching for nothing. The stone fell again and again, until breath no longer came from the mouth that had once spoken his name. The silence that followed was worse than the act itself. No bird cried out, no wind disturbed the grass. The world simply accepted what had been done, folding it into its endless stillness. Cain stood over the body, his chest rising and falling, his fingers loosening around the stone until it slipped into the dirt. Abel lay as if sleeping, his face turned slightly toward the sun, but the color had already begun to drain, leaving the skin pale, almost translucent. The warmth was fading. Cain knelt beside him, not to help, not to mourn, but as if compelled to see what absence looked like up close. He reached out once, fingertips brushing the hair at his brother's temple, and felt the heat already retreating into the earth. The grass beneath Abel's head was darkening, the soil drinking deeply. A single fly landed on the still flesh, its legs trembling as it moved. Cain watched it, unblinking. The weight in his chest did not lift. There was no release, no satisfaction. Only a hollowness that seemed to spread, filling the space where his brother's presence had been. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, his shadow falling across the body like a final mark. For a moment, he looked at the horizon, the same hills, the same light, the same distant trees, and knew they would never again be what they had been. The field had taken something it could not return. When he turned to leave, he did not look back, but the image of Abel lying in the grass with his eyes half closed and his mouth slightly open would not leave him. It followed him in the rhythm of his steps, in the smell of iron that clung to his hands, in the knowledge that he had crossed a boundary no man before him had touched. The world did not speak. It simply went on, carrying the weight of what it had witnessed. As Cain walked away from the place where breath had ended and silence had begun, the sun had begun its slow descent when the question came. It did not arrive with thunder or the tearing of the sky. It came like the weight of a shadow over the heart, like a voice that was not heard with the ears, but felt inside the marrow. "Where is your brother?" Cain froze. The field lay behind him, hidden now by distance, but the image of it pressed against his mind like a wound that refused to close. The air seemed heavier, harder to breathe. He did not turn toward the voice. "I do not know," he said. The words shaped carefully, almost gently, as if a soft tone could make them true. "Am I my brother Sit's keeper?" Silence followed, but it was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of a gaze that could not be evaded, of truth already known. And in that silence, something shifted in the earth beneath his feet. The ground was not still. It seemed to throb faintly, as though it carried within it a heartbeat not its own. And with it came a sound, not loud, not even fully formed, but there, a cry that was not a cry, a resonance that rose through the soil and into the bones of his legs. It was Abel's voice without words, a presence that did not fade with death. "Your brother Sit's blood cries out to me from the ground." The words cut through him. The earth itself had become the witness, the first witness, holding in its dark chambers the memory of what he had done. No hand could hide it, no stone could cover it. The soil had swallowed Abel, but it had not buried him. Cain's mouth was dry. His body felt both leaden and hollow, the horizon blurred, as if the world itself was pulling away from him. He thought of the moment in the field, of the way Abel's warmth had fled into the ground. Now that warmth was gone, but the ground had kept the heat of the blood, the sound of the life leaving. The judgment came without haste, without cruelty, but with the cold finality of something already decided. He was named for what he was, for what he had done. No sentence needed to be shouted. The truth itself was the sentence. The earth that had once yielded to him would turn against him. Every step would be heavier, every harvest thinner, every drink of water tinged with the memory of what it carried away. And he would walk, far from home, far from the place where the blood had been spilled, but the ground beneath his feet would never again feel like his own. Cain did not answer. There was nothing to answer. The question had already passed, the truth already spoken, the judgment already sealed, and beneath it all, he could still feel it. The slow, steady pulse in the soil, the voice that would not be silenced. The sentence was not death. Perhaps he had expected it, a swift severing, the end of breath, the closing of his story beneath the same earth that had betrayed him. But death did not come. Instead, something colder was laid upon him, life stretched out before him without home, without rest, without a place where the ground would welcome his tread. The mark was given, though no hand touched him. It was not carved into his flesh, not inked into his skin, but it clung to him all the same. It was a weight in the air around him, a shift in the gaze of any who looked his way. It said, "Here is the man who spilled his brother's blood." It said, "Do not strike him, for he is already carrying what no man can lay down." The Cain turned from the place where judgment had been spoken. The horizon lay open, but it was not freedom, it was emptiness. Each step forward pulled him farther from the voices that had once called his name, farther from the firelight where shadows had once gathered in familiar shapes. The sun pressed hard on his back, the heat sinking into his shoulders until it felt like another brand. The earth had changed beneath him. Once it had yielded to his hands, softening under his care. Now it resisted, its crust unbroken, its plants turning brittle when he passed. The wind, when it came, was dry, carrying the scent of dust and distance. No bird followed him, no beast lingered near. He walked until the shape of his family's tents was no more than a memory behind him. There was no farewell, no last look from those he left behind. They did not follow, they did not call. Perhaps they watched him go. Perhaps they turned away before his figure grew small. He would never know. The nights were the worst. Alone beneath the sky, he would feel the pull of the darkness around him, vast and without mercy. The stars did not blink for him. The fire he built was small, its light revealing only the ground immediately around him, leaving the rest of the world in a silence that pressed against his skin. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it came with dreams. Abel's voice, Abel's shadow, Abel's blood pooling in the soil. He would wake with the taste of dust in his mouth, the wind colder than it had been when he closed his eyes. There was no path, only the choice to keep moving. The mark burned without burning, a reminder that his life was not his own to end. He was a living sentence, carried forward on tired feet, his presence a warning and a memory in equal measure. In time, even the sound of his own name began to fade in his mind, replaced by the steady rhythm of steps over barren ground. But somewhere, far behind him, the earth still held the cry of his brother's blood, and it would follow him always, not in sound, but in the knowledge that it could never be silenced. It did not end in that field. The body lay still, but the act lived on, moving outward like a ripple that would never fade. What had begun as a single blow in silence became something woven into the fabric of human breath. From that day, the earth knew the taste of blood, and it never forgot. Generations came and went, each carrying the shadow of that first wound. Brothers still walked together, still spoke together, still worked side by side. But somewhere in the space between them, a quiet question lingered: could it happen again? The answer, unspoken, was already yes. The ground that drank Abel's blood did not remain holy. It drank more. It drank from sons who turned against fathers, from kings who slaughtered rivals, from crowds that cheered while stones struck flesh. The blood of Cain was no longer unthinkable. It had precedent. And precedent is a door that once opened can never truly be shut. There were moments in the ages that followed when the world seemed to tremble with it. Battlefields where the soil turned black, marketplaces where the gutters ran red, walls where the stains never washed clean, and always in the center of it, a face looking down at what they had done, finding that the silence afterward felt the same as it must have felt for Cain. Innocence did not vanish all at once. It faded slowly, carried off grain by grain. The killing became easier, the hesitation shorter, the excuses more elaborate. It was no longer the unbearable crime of one man. It was the inheritance of all. Yet the earth has never grown indifferent. Even now it remembers every drop it takes, settles deep into its memory, each one another line in a ledger that began with Abel. And if you walk far enough into the quiet places, away from the voices and the dust, you may feel it, that same low hum beneath your feet, the sound of what it holds, of what it cannot forgive. The first murder was not just the loss of a life. It was the loss of a boundary, the shattering of a fragile wall that had stood since the dawn of breath. Once it fell, it could not be rebuilt. And from then until now, the earth has never been dry.